My name is Emily Carter. I was 29 years old when my entire life quietly cracked apart in the middle of one ordinary summer. I worked as a financial consultant at a bank in Nashville, Tennessee, helping people make decisions about retirement funds, home loans, and investments that would shape the course of their futures. I spent years teaching strangers how to protect their money and secure their lives. What I never expected was that I would one day need those same skills to protect myself from my own family. The phone call with my father should have ended like any other conversation. It lasted barely 2 minutes before he muttered that he needed to go. If the line had disconnected right there, none of what happened afterward would have unfolded the way it did. But he forgot I was still connected. I stood in the kitchen of the home my grandmother had left me, while his voice drifted back through the speaker, distant now, careless and cruel in a way I had never fully heard before. Then came the sentence that changed everything. He called me a burden. Not his daughter, not someone he loved, a burden. I stayed frozen beside the kitchen counter, staring at the hardwood floor beneath my feet while the reality settled over me like ice water. This was the same house I had spent years maintaining, the same house I had welcomed my parents into because I still believed patience, loyalty, and generosity could eventually earn love. While they vacationed through Europe, posting smiling pictures from expensive restaurants and historic landmarks, I stayed behind handling bills, paperwork, repairs, and every responsibility they conveniently left in my hands. And in one careless moment, I learned the truth. The guilt they used on me, the smiles, the constant reminders about family obligation, none of it had been real. Underneath all of it was entitlement. I didn't interrupt them. I didn't call my father back. I didn't warn them about what was coming. I simply stayed quiet. And by the time they returned home from Europe, rolling their expensive luggage up the front walkway with relaxed smiles on their faces, the locks had already been changed. The key no longer worked. The house was empty, and the only thing waiting for them inside was a note. After I overheard my father call me a burden, I stood motionless in my grandmother's kitchen, with my hand gripping the edge of the counter so tightly my knuckles hurt. I wish I could say I ended the call immediately with some kind of dignity, but I didn't. I stayed there listening while my parents spoke about me like I wasn't even their daughter. They talked about me the way people discuss a disappointing investment, something that had failed to produce the return they expected. My mother laughed first, soft, dismissive, bored. Then my father said the house should have belonged to them from the beginning, because parents were supposed to come before children. He claimed I'd been handed everything in life, which would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so vicious. The reality was completely different. I had worked since I was 16 years old. I earned scholarships. I built my own career without anyone carrying me. After my grandmother passed away, every single expense connected to that house came from me. Taxes, insurance, repairs, utilities, groceries. My parents contributed opinions. They talked about me like I was weak because I still wanted their approval. My mother said that once they returned home, they'd easily pressure me into adding their names to the property because I hated disappointing them. Then my father said something that made the room feel suddenly colder. He admitted he had already taken on debt because he fully expected the house to become theirs eventually. He said it casually, confidently, like my future had already been reassigned to them without my permission. That was the moment I understood this wasn't simply entitlement anymore. It was a long-term plan. I finally hung up the phone and sat there in complete silence, replaying every word in my mind. Slowly, I looked around the kitchen and started noticing things I had ignored for years. My mother's decorations had replaced the artwork my grandmother loved. My father's oversized recliner dominated the living room like a throne. Their voices, routines, and demands had gradually pushed me to the edges of my own home, until I barely recognized my place in it anymore. When my grandmother Evelyn left me that house in Nashville, she did it intentionally. She wanted me to have something nobody could take from me. I still remembered sitting in the attorney's office while the will was read aloud. My parents smiled too quickly that day, pretending to be supportive while disappointment flashed across their faces. At first, they said all the right things. They told me I deserved it. They said Grandma trusted me. Then only a few months later, they suggested moving in temporarily to save money and spend more time together as a family. Temporary slowly became permanent without anyone ever admitting it out loud. I paid for everything while they settled deeper into comfort. And because I wanted to believe it was love, I kept allowing it. That night, after the phone call, I expected to cry. Instead, I felt something colder: clarity. I opened my laptop at the kitchen island and started building a plan. Legal steps, financial protection, moving arrangements, exit strategy. If my father believed my silence meant weakness, he was about to learn what silence looked like when it stopped asking for permission. The next morning, the first person I contacted was a property attorney named Melissa Grant. Our bank had worked with her office before, and I trusted her professionalism. I didn't tell her the emotional version of the story. I gave her facts instead because facts survive where emotions don't. The house was legally mine. The deed was clean. My grandmother's will was explicit. My parents had never paid rent. They had no ownership rights whatsoever. Melissa confirmed exactly what I needed to hear. Legally, I could sell the house whenever I wanted. They had no authority to stop me and no claim to any money from the sale. She advised me to document everything carefully and handle their belongings properly to avoid unnecessary complications later. But the important part never changed. The property belonged to me. Hearing that from someone completely outside the emotional mess cut through years of guilt in seconds. Afterward, I called Ryan Mitchell, a real estate agent I trusted because he specialized in discreet private sales. I told him I needed the house sold quickly, quietly, and with as little public attention as possible. No signs in the yard, no open houses, no neighborhood gossip. He warned me that fast sales sometimes meant sacrificing top dollar, but Nashville's market was still strong, and the house itself was beautiful. Based on recent estimates, it was worth close to $1 million. I told him speed mattered more than pride. He started contacting serious buyers that same afternoon. Then I moved on to the part I understood best: money. I opened entirely new bank accounts in another city. I transferred my savings, changed every password I had, froze my credit, secured important documents, rerouted my mail, and closed every possible opening my parents might try to use later. I wasn't overreacting. I was finally protecting myself. My father had spent years confusing access with ownership. I was done leaving the door unlocked for people who believed my life belonged to them. A few days later, I rented a furnished apartment in Louisville, Kentucky. It was small and temporary, but it gave me distance, and distance suddenly felt priceless. I bought a new phone, created a private email address, and quietly began removing pieces of my life from the house, while my parents continued posting cheerful photos from Venice and Paris, like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong for them. During the day, I worked normally at the bank. At night, I packed. Every drawer I opened felt like uncovering evidence from an older version of my life. My grandmother's presence still lingered everywhere beneath the layers my parents had added over the years. I found handwritten recipes folded into kitchen books, old gardening gloves with dirt trapped in the seams, birthday cards she had saved, and little notes she used to leave for herself. One evening, I found a card she had given me shortly before she died. Inside, she had written one sentence: "Never confuse being needed with being loved." At the time, I thought it was just one of those wise little sayings grandparents liked to write inside greeting cards. Standing there surrounded by cardboard boxes and packing tape, I finally understood she had been trying to warn me long before I was ready to hear it. 5 days after I contacted Ryan, he called with serious offers from 2 buyers. One was a young couple relocating from Atlanta. The other was a doctor moving to Nashville with her family. Both wanted discreet deals, and both could move quickly. I let Ryan handle the private showings while my parents continued enjoying Europe on money they never should have spent so freely. Every time my mother uploaded another smiling photo, captioned with words like gratitude and family blessings, my stomach twisted harder. They were celebrating their future while secretly planning to take mine. The stronger offer came in before the week ended. Clean financing, minimal complications, fast closing. I accepted immediately. We scheduled the final paperwork for just a few days before my parents' return flight home. Timing mattered. I didn't want a screaming confrontation in the driveway or another opportunity for manipulation face to face. I wanted them confident right up until the exact second reality collapsed underneath them. While the sale moved through escrow, I handled the hardest part. I hired movers. I carefully separated everything in the house into categories with almost obsessive attention. My belongings, my grandmother's belongings, my parents' belongings. Nothing was damaged, Nothing was stolen. Nothing was handled carelessly. I rented a storage unit under my parents' names and prepaid 6 months in advance because I refused to give them even a single legitimate reason to accuse me of cruelty later. The more organized I became, the calmer I felt. Not because I lacked emotions, because for the first time in my life, all my energy was finally going toward protecting myself instead of managing everyone else's reactions. The closing happened on a bright Thursday morning. It should have felt dramatic, but strangely, it didn't. I wore a dark blazer, sat at the conference table, signed every document placed in front of me, and answered questions in a steady voice, while ownership of the house officially transferred out of my hands. That home had held every version of my adult life. It held memories of my grandmother, memories of grief after she passed, and memories of slowly realizing that love becomes dangerous when it comes attached to calculation and control. When the final signature was complete, the money transferred into my account almost instantly. The house no longer belonged to me. I expected heartbreak. What I felt instead was relief so deep it almost embarrassed me. Ryan hugged me outside the office afterward and quietly asked if I was okay. I told him the truth. I said I finally would be. Then I drove back to the house one last time to meet the movers. That part hurt more than selling it. Every room reminded me of how hard I had tried to be enough for people who only valued what I could provide. The dining room where I hosted holidays while my parents criticized everything from the food to the decorations. The hallway where my mother proudly referred to it as the family home, without ever acknowledging it legally belonged to me. The upstairs bedroom where I spent countless nights wondering why being a good daughter never seemed to earn actual love. The movers worked for hours. My furniture, clothing, work files, personal keepsakes, and everything specifically left to me by my grandmother went onto one truck headed toward Louisville. My parents' furniture, clothes, documents, photo albums, and personal belongings went into another truck bound for the storage facility. I labeled every container carefully so there would be no excuses later. When both trucks finally pulled away, the house became silent in a way I had never heard before. Empty, still, almost peaceful. I walked through every room one last time. Without my parents' things crowding the space, the house looked larger and brighter. In the kitchen, I stopped beside the island where I had overheard my father call me a burden. And for the first time since that phone call, I let myself feel everything. The humiliation, the anger, the heartbreak of realizing some people only love what they can control. Then I reached into my purse and took out the note I had written the night before. I had rewritten it several times, trying to sound clever or powerful, until eventually I realized simple honesty was enough. In the end, I wrote only 2 words: good luck. I placed the note in the center of the kitchen counter, where they couldn't possibly miss it. Then I locked the front door, slid the keys through the mail slot, and walked away. As I drove down the street, I looked at the house in my rearview mirror exactly once. My grandmother had given me more than property. She had given me a chance to choose myself when the moment finally came. And this time, I did. The first night in my new apartment felt strange in a way I couldn't fully explain. The place was unfamiliar, smaller than the house in Nashville, and almost painfully quiet. But underneath all that unfamiliarity was something I hadn't felt in years: peace. No one questioned what I ordered for dinner. No one asked invasive questions about my savings. No one reminded me how much had supposedly been sacrificed for me. I dropped my suitcase near the wall, sat on the edge of the bed, and waited for guilt to crush me. It never came. What finally hit me instead was exhaustion, the kind that only appears after survival mode finally loosens its grip. I slept longer that night than I had in months. Over the next 2 days, I resisted the urge to track my parents' flight home. I didn't check arrival times or obsess over the exact moment they would discover the truth. I knew I would hear about it soon enough. People like my parents never accepted consequences quietly. Late Sunday afternoon, my old phone lit up with the first missed call from my father, then another, then my mother, then both of them repeatedly. I stared at the screen, imagining them standing in the driveway with expensive luggage beside them, confused expressions slowly turning into panic as they realized the locks no longer worked. I didn't answer. About an hour later, the voicemails started arriving. At first, my father sounded irritated, like he assumed I was throwing some dramatic tantrum. Then came anger, then panic. My mother's messages shifted even faster. Concern turned into accusation within minutes. By the end of the night, I had 17 missed calls, multiple voicemails, and more texts than I bothered reading. I listened to only one message completely. My father was shouting that I had no right to do this to them. That almost made me laugh. No right? As if he hadn't already decided he had rights to my home, my finances, and my future. I placed the phone face down on the kitchen table and made myself tea. For the first time in my entire life, their chaos existed somewhere outside my immediate reach. The next morning, the messages got uglier. My father demanded my address. My mother accused me of abandoning family. Then came threats about lawyers, police reports, lawsuits, humiliation, and revenge. Every single message proved the same thing. They still believed fear would force me back into obedience. I ignored all of it. Around 10 that morning, my branch manager called sounding unusually careful. My parents had shown up at the bank demanding to see me. My father accused me of illegally selling the family home and stealing his retirement plans. According to security staff, he raised his voice in the lobby while my mother cried loudly enough to attract attention from customers nearby. Eventually, security escorted them out. I apologized for the disruption and calmly explained the truth. The house legally belonged to me. The sale was valid. I had full documentation if the bank ever needed proof. My manager surprised me. Instead of questioning me, she told me to take whatever time I needed and not to worry about my job. After the call ended, I sat there quietly for a long moment. My parents had tried to drag my career into their chaos, hoping fear would pull me back under their control. Instead, they had only exposed themselves publicly. By the third day, extended family started contacting me. Some genuinely sounded worried. Others were obviously hunting for gossip. I kept my responses short and careful. I told the people I trusted that the situation was legal, private, and no longer open for discussion. Meanwhile, I saved every threatening voicemail and screenshot and forwarded the worst ones to Melissa. She told me I was handling everything correctly. Then, on the fourth day, I received a text from an unfamiliar number. "We need to meet face to face like adults." I knew immediately it was my father before he even confirmed it in the next message. He wanted to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Nashville. He said if I refused, they would continue showing up at my workplace until I stopped hiding from them. I read the message 3 times before something finally became clear to me. He still thought this situation was about power. He still believed if he pushed hard enough, I would eventually fall back into my old role. So I agreed to meet him, but entirely on my terms. I chose a crowded coffee shop in the middle of the afternoon and intentionally arrived 15 minutes late. The moment I walked inside, I spotted them immediately. My father, Michael Carter, looked older than he had only a few weeks earlier. Not physically weak, just diminished somehow, like certainty had been ripped away from him and replaced entirely with anger. My mother, Diane Carter, still carried herself with the polished posture she used in public settings, but tension sat heavily across her face. For the first time in my life, they looked like strangers. I stopped beside the table without sitting down immediately. My father told me to sit, as if he still had authority over me. I sat because I chose to, not because he commanded it. He started talking before I even removed my coat. Where was I living? Where were their belongings? Did I understand how humiliating this had been for them? How could I embarrass family this way? I let him speak until he exhausted himself. Then I asked one simple question. "Did you really think I never heard what you said on the phone?" Silence slammed across the table. My mother looked at him first instead of me, and that reaction alone told me everything I needed to know. My father immediately tried to backtrack. He claimed I misunderstood the conversation. He blamed stress, fatigue, travel pressure, anything except the truth. My mother added that families say hurtful things all the time without meaning them. I listened quietly. Then I placed my phone on the table and pressed play. I didn't need the entire conversation, only the important part. My father calling me a burden. My mother saying I could still be manipulated because I craved their approval. My father confidently discussing the house eventually becoming theirs. The audio wasn't loud, but in the silence around us, it sounded deafening. My mother went pale. My father's face turned dark red almost instantly. Then, instead of apologizing, he accused me of betraying them by recording the call. That was the exact moment I understood there was truly nothing left to save. People who feel remorse sound remorseful. People who get caught sound offended. My father leaned across the table, lowering his voice like he was trying to regain control of the situation through sheer force. He said parents deserved support after everything they sacrificed to raise a child. There it was again, the truth, not hidden anymore, not softened, not disguised behind guilt or family language. To him, love was transactional. Children were investments, and repayment was expected forever. I looked directly at him and told him something I should have said years earlier. Raising a child does not create lifelong ownership over them. Neither of my parents spoke, so I continued. I told them I would never again support them financially. I would never house them, discuss my money with them, or allow them access to my personal life. I explained that their belongings were safely stored in a prepaid unit, and that was the final practical favor they would ever receive from me. That was when my mother began crying. Normally, her tears would have destroyed me. For years, I rushed to comfort her anytime she cried because I mistook emotion for innocence. But something inside me had changed. This time, I only saw manipulation wrapped in sadness. My father interrupted her and said they had nowhere suitable to live because he had already made plans based on eventually inheriting the house. The moment he said it, he destroyed his own argument without realizing it. He had built his future around something that never belonged to him. I stood up to leave, and that was when the mask finally disappeared completely. My father called me selfish, cold, ungrateful. Then, with bitterness so raw it almost startled me, he said I had ruined his life. I looked at him calmly and answered the only truthful thing left to say. No, you built your life around something that was never yours. Then I walked out. At the time, I believed that conversation would finally end everything. I was wrong. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They come in waves. Melissa sent my father a formal legal warning after he left additional voicemails threatening to challenge the home sale in court. The letter didn't stop him from trying to intimidate me, but it did stop him from pretending he had any real legal standing. 2 separate attorneys refused to take his case after reviewing the deed and my grandmother's will. The house had belonged to me. The sale was legal. The money was mine. End of discussion. But while his fantasy collapsed legally, reality started catching up financially. One of my cousins eventually told me my father hadn't simply talked recklessly during that trip to Europe. He had actually borrowed money based on the assumption he would soon control the house. Personal loans, credit cards, even refinancing his vehicle. He spent money like a man expecting a huge payout in the near future. And when that payout disappeared, the debt remained. At first, my mother blamed him privately. Later, she blamed him publicly too. Family members quietly repeated pieces of arguments they overheard between them. According to relatives, my mother claimed she didn't realize how serious their financial situation had become, although I suspected she knew far more than she admitted. Either way, their marriage started cracking under pressure almost immediately. The smug teamwork they once shared turned into resentment. Then came the public fallout. A week after our coffee shop meeting, my father went to the storage facility, furious that the unit wasn't larger. He yelled at the manager in front of several customers and caused another scene loud enough to attract attention. Unfortunately for him, one of the witnesses recognized him from the car dealership where he worked part-time. Another happened to know someone in his office. Small communities connect information fast. Within days, people were whispering. And this time, the problem wasn't gossip, it was his behavior. About a month later, he lost the job at the dealership entirely. Officially, management described it as professionalism concerns and staffing changes. Unofficially, everyone understood the truth. An older salesman publicly unraveling over his daughter, debt, and a house that had never belonged to him wasn't exactly good for business. Losing the job hurt him financially, but losing his image hurt him even worse. My father could survive stress as long as he still felt superior. What he couldn't survive was exposure, because underneath all his confidence was a man who depended heavily on appearances and control. Once those disappeared, there wasn't much left hiding underneath. Without the dealership income, The expensive car quickly became impossible to maintain. He sold it. Not long afterward, my parents moved out of the extended stay hotel they had been using since returning from Europe and into a cramped apartment outside the city. Ironically, it was exactly the type of place my father used to mock openly. My mother, who once wandered through other people's homes making passive comments about furniture, cleanliness, and standards, now had neighbors screaming through thin apartment walls late at night. I only knew because people talked. One afternoon, a woman from my grandmother's old church called me and mentioned, with obvious satisfaction, that she'd seen my parents carrying cheap furniture up a narrow staircase at their apartment building. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need details. By then, I finally understood something important. My father's real punishment was never losing the house. It was being forced to confront who he actually was, without wealth, control, or illusion protecting him anymore. He once called me weak because I wanted approval. But in the end, I wasn't the person who built an entire future around manipulation and borrowed money. I wasn't the one begging reality to bend after it refused. And strangely enough, once all of it unfolded, triumph wasn't the emotion I felt most strongly. Distance was. Emotional distance. Every angry voicemail from my father and every softer message from my mother carried the same hidden expectation underneath. They still believed my purpose was making their lives easier. This time, I refused to return to that role. And silence accomplished more in a single month than years of explaining myself ever had. I stopped answering their calls completely after that. No more defending myself, no more explaining, no more trying to translate basic respect into a language they refused to understand. Instead, I focused on building a life that finally belonged to me. I threw myself into my work in Louisville. I started therapy for the first time in years and slowly began rebuilding routines that weren't centered around managing other people's emotions. I bought groceries without guilt. I slept through the night. I learned what it felt like to make decisions without immediately fearing how someone else would react. The changes were small at first. Then they became everything. Around Thanksgiving, my mother sent a message that almost reached me emotionally. Not because it was sincere, but because it was written carefully. She talked about families breaking and healing. She said pride had already destroyed enough. She claimed my father was depressed and embarrassed. She described the apartment as tiny and uncomfortable. She admitted mistakes had been made, but reminded me that they were still my parents. For a few minutes, I almost believed the message was genuine. Then I reached the final paragraph. She asked whether I would consider helping them pay the security deposit on a better apartment since I had more than enough money after selling the house. And just like that, whatever softness remained inside me went cold again. Even standing at the edge of collapse, they still viewed me as financial rescue, still saw me as access, still believed reconciliation should lead directly back to my bank account. I deleted the message and went for a walk through the cold evening air. For the first time in months, I smiled naturally without forcing it. My father once believed my silence protected him because it meant I would quietly absorb everything. Instead, my silence became the exact thing that destroyed every illusion he had built his future around. A year later, my life barely resembled the one I used to live. I had purchased a townhouse in Louisville with white kitchen cabinets, oversized windows, and far too many plants scattered throughout the living room. Sometimes I would stop in the middle of the day and look around simply to remind myself the peace was real. At work, I had been promoted at the bank. Not because surviving family betrayal magically transformed me into some inspirational movie character, but because clarity changes people. I was finally thinking clearly all the time. Before, half my energy disappeared into emotional management, anticipating moods, preventing conflict, protecting my parents from consequences, and constantly trying to earn approval that was never truly available. Once that weight disappeared, my focus sharpened naturally. Good sleep helps careers, so does peace, and so does no longer being emotionally drained by people who confuse control with love. As time passed, My experience began shaping my work in unexpected ways. I started noticing how many younger clients, especially women, walked into financial meetings carrying invisible family pressure they couldn't fully explain. Parents asking to be added onto bank accounts, partners pressuring them to co-sign loans they barely understood, relatives disguising control as closeness. I recognized the look in their eyes because I had worn it for years. Eventually, I approached my branch manager with an idea. A few months later, I began hosting free evening seminars called Financial Boundaries and Family Pressure. I kept everything practical and straightforward. We discussed debt, property rights, emergency savings, co-signing risks, digital security, and the difference between helping someone temporarily versus becoming their long-term financial plan. But underneath all those practical lessons was a deeper truth. Love that depends on access to your money, your home, or your fear is not healthy love. One evening after a seminar ended, a young woman stayed behind after everyone else left. She looked about 23 or 24 and kept twisting the sleeve of her sweater nervously while standing beside the refreshment table. When I asked if she was okay, she started crying almost immediately. Not loudly, just the kind of quiet crying that happens when someone has been holding in fear for far too long. She explained that her parents wanted her to take out a large loan in her name to save their struggling business. When she hesitated, they called her selfish and accused her of abandoning family. Then she said something that hit me hard. "I love them, but I don't know how to say no without feeling like a terrible daughter." I listened carefully before answering. Then I told her something I desperately wish someone had told me years earlier. Protecting yourself does not make you cruel. Boundaries are not punishment. They are information. They teach people where your responsibility ends and where their entitlement can no longer continue. She hugged me before leaving. After the door closed behind her, I stood alone in the quiet conference room thinking about my grandmother. Thinking about how clearly she had seen the pattern long before I ever did. One house, one overheard sentence, one decision to finally stop explaining myself. That was all it took to completely change the direction of my life. I don't hate my parents. People are usually surprised when I say that, but it's true. Hate keeps you emotionally tied to the thing that hurt you. What I feel now is acceptance. Michael Carter is the kind of man who mistakes control for respect. Diane Carter is the kind of woman who mistakes manipulation for peacekeeping, as long as the family image stays intact. That is who they are. My responsibility is not fixing them. My responsibility is making sure their damage never defines me again. More than anything else, that became the real lesson. Sometimes pain becomes valuable because it finally gives a name to patterns you spent years surviving without understanding. Financial abuse, conditional love, emotional blackmail. Once you can name a pattern clearly, you stop living inside it blindly. And sometimes, the most important thing you can teach another person is that family should never require you to surrender your dignity just to belong. I used to believe being a good daughter meant enduring more, sacrificing more, forgiving faster, and staying silent no matter how badly it hurt me. Now I believe being a healthy adult means telling yourself the truth first, even when that truth destroys someone else's version of you. And if anything good came from what happened, it was this. I no longer confuse guilt with responsibility. I no longer confuse pressure with love. And I no longer believe saving yourself requires permission from anyone else. My father was wrong about one thing that day on the phone. I was never the burden. I was the one carrying everyone else. The moment I finally put that weight down was the moment my real life finally began. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose yourself over toxic people in your life? I'd really love to hear your story. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss the next powerful story.